New Jersey, 1945. Ellis Island. The processing hall stretched vast and cold, echoing with voices in a dozen languages. At Station 12, a German woman stood before an American sergeant, emptying her pockets onto a metal tray. Coins, a photograph, a scrap of paper with an address. Then she removed her wedding ring, thin gold, worn smooth by years, and held it in her palm. Her fingers closed around it. The sergeant reached forward. She pulled back. What she said next, and what the sergeant did in response, would ripple through that processing station like a stone dropped in still water. The morning fog over New York Harbor hung thick as wool. The Liberty ship USS General William Mitchell emerged from the gray, carrying 300 German civilians, women, children, elderly men being too frail or too insignificant for prosecution. They'd been selected from camps across the British occupation zone, processed through Southampton, loaded onto ships that once carried American troops toward Normandy, and now returned carrying the defeated. Helene Richter stood at the rail, watching the Statue of Liberty materialize through the mist. She was 34 years old, from Munich. Her husband had been an architect before the war, designing apartment buildings and schools in the Schwabing district. He'd been drafted in 1941, sent east, and stopped writing letters in the winter of 1943. The Red Cross had confirmed his death 2 years later, frozen in a trench outside Stalingrad, though the official notice used more diplomatic language. She'd survived by translating documents for British occupation authorities, by living in a basement room where 4 families shared one toilet, by standing in food lines that stretched for blocks, by teaching her daughter English using a primer salvaged from a bombed library, and by never removing the wedding ring Thomas had placed on her finger in 1936, when Munich still hosted summer festivals and the future seemed navigable. The ship docked at dawn. Processing began immediately. 300 people divided into lines, sorted by age and gender, funneled through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and bureaucracy. Helene held her daughter's hand. Emma was 9 years old, small for her age, with blonde hair darkened by months without proper washing. The child hadn't cried when they'd left Germany, hadn't cried during the Atlantic crossing when storms made half the passengers seasick. She'd simply grown quieter, as if sound itself had become a luxury they couldn't afford. Ellis Island's great hall, overwhelmed with its scale, vaulted ceiling, American flags hanging in precise symmetry, rows of wooden benches where immigrants had waited since the previous century, hoping for entry into the country, and now held them as something between refugees and prisoners. Signs in English directed people toward medical inspection, document verification, luggage examination, personal effects inventory. Station 12 handled personal effects for women traveling alone with children. The procedure was straightforward: empty pockets, remove jewelry, surrender currency, receive itemized receipt, proceed to next station. The goal was inventory, not theft. Protection, not confiscation. Americans prided themselves on treating even enemy civilians with a fairness their own governments had abandoned. Sergeant Raymond Cole managed Station 12, 41 years old, from Nebraska. Career military who'd served in the Philippines before the war, seen combat in North Africa and Sicily, then been reassigned to occupation duty after shrapnel tore through his left knee during the drive into Germany. He walked with a cane now, stood for hours at the processing station, recording possessions, issuing receipts, maintaining the fiction that possessions mattered to people who'd lost everything else. He'd processed 200 German women that morning. Each one followed the procedure without resistance. Watches, rings, earrings, necklaces all removed, cataloged, secured. Most women surrendered their jewelry with relief, happy to trade metal for documentation that proved they existed, that someone somewhere kept records of their names. Helene reached Station 12 at 1400 hours, when afternoon light slanted through the high windows and turned dust motes into constellations. She stood before Cole's desk, Emma pressed against her side. Cole gestured to the metal tray. Spoke in English Helene mostly understood. "Personal effects, ma'am." "Everything in the tray. You'll get a receipt." Helene nodded. Reached into her coat pocket threadbare wool, patched at the elbows, missing 2 buttons. Produced a coin purse containing 47 Deutschmarks, worthless now, but kept from habit. A photograph of Thomas in his architect's office before the uniform. A letter from her mother, who died during an air raid in 1944. A pencil stub. A button. She placed each item in the tray with the care people reserve for sacred objects. Cole recorded them on his form. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. He'd seen hundreds of similar collections that day, the pathetic inventory of lives reduced to pocket contents. Then Helene began removing her jewelry. 2 small earrings, silver, tarnished. She placed them in the tray. A bracelet her daughter had made from wire and beads, worthless except as memory. Into the tray. Cole recorded each item. Finally, she reached for her wedding ring. Her fingers touched the gold band, twisted it slightly. The ring had worn a groove in her finger over 9 years. She could feel the slight resistance as she began to pull it over her knuckle. Her hand stopped, fingers trembling, not obviously. Just the slightest movement, like trees and wind that hasn't reached the ground yet. She looked at Cole, then at the ring, then at Emma, who watched with the blank expression children adopt when they've learned that crying changes nothing. Helene's hand closed around the ring. She pulled it off, held it in her palm. The gold caught the afternoon light. Thin band, no stones, just metal worn smooth by years of wearing. She stared at it the way people stare at things they're about to lose forever. Cole extended his hand for the ring. Standard procedure. He'd collected 37 wedding rings that day alone. Would collect 50 more before his shift ended. Each one recorded, tagged, secured. Each one representing a marriage that war had dissolved, or death had ended, or distance had made irrelevant. Helene didn't place the ring in the tray. She held it tighter. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came quiet but clear. English words practiced during the Atlantic crossing. "Please don't take my wedding ring. It's all I have left." The processing station didn't stop. Other women moved through other lines. Other sergeants recorded other inventories. But at Station 12, Cole's hand remained extended. Helene's remained closed. And something hung in the air between them that neither bureaucracy nor procedure had accounted for. Cole looked at the woman before him, saw what he'd been trained to see past, the individual human being beneath the enemy civilian designation. Helene Richter, 34 years old, widow, mother, survivor of a war that had destroyed her country and scattered her life like ash. His hand remained extended. Protocol demanded he take the ring, process it, tag it, secure it with the others in the locked box that would travel to a warehouse in Brooklyn where thousands of confiscated items waited in careful inventory. The ring would receive a number. Helene would receive a receipt. In theory, she could reclaim it later, once her status was determined, once authorities decided whether she'd be repatriated or resettled or detained indefinitely. In practice, Cole knew what happened to those items. The warehouse overflowed. The tracking system collapsed under volume. Objects got misplaced, misfiled, redistributed to other refugees who'd lost similar things. The bureaucracy that promised to protect personal effects couldn't keep that promise. Too many people, too many objects, too much chaos disguised as procedure. He'd taken 37 wedding rings that day. Would take 50 more. Had taken hundreds during previous shifts. Each time, he told himself he was following orders, maintaining inventory, protecting the system that would eventually theoretically return these objects to their owners. But he'd never had someone beg. The other women had surrendered their rings with resignation or relief, or the blank acceptance of people Hudi stopped expecting anything different from authority. Helene was the first to close her hand, to pull back, to speak the words that made the transaction personal rather than procedural. "Ma'am," Cole said slowly, "regulations require all valuables be secured during processing. You'll receive a receipt. You can reclaim your ring once your status is finalized." The translator standing nearby, a German-American corporal from Pennsylvania, began converting Cole's words. Helene shook her head before he finished. "I know what receipt means," she said in halting English. "I know what, once status is finalized, means. It means never. It means lost in warehouse. It means gone." She wasn't wrong. Cole felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest, the sensation of being caught between what he was ordered to do and what he knew was right. He'd felt this before, in Sicily, when orders came to shell a village suspected of harboring snipers. In Germany, when his unit had been ordered to demolish a historic church because it offered strategic sightlines. Every time, he'd followed orders because that's what soldiers did. Every time, he'd regretted it. Emma pressed closer to her mother. The child's eyes moved between the sergeant and the ring, understanding without language that something important was being decided. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules." "I know." Helene's voice cracked slightly. She swallowed. Continued in careful English. "I know you don't make rules. I know you follow orders. I know I am enemy. I know I have no rights here." She opened her hand, showing the ring in her palm. "But this ring is all I have from my husband. He is dead 3 years. This ring is only thing I keep from before, from when we were happy, when my daughter had father, when Munich had music and lights in future." She paused, breath catching. Cole saw tears forming but not falling. Helene blinked them back with the discipline of someone who'd learned to ration even emotion. "Please," she said again, "please don't take my wedding ring." The processing station continued around them. Voices echoed. Boots struck tile floors. Other sergeants called next in line, maintain order please. But at Station 12, time seemed to slow. Cole held his hand extended. Helene held her hand closed. And every second that passed made the choice harder. Cole thought about his own wife, Margaret, back in Nebraska, raising their 2 sons alone while he served overseas. He'd given her a ring better gold, proper diamond, bought with 3 months' savings. She wore it every day, wrote about it in her letters, told him it reminded her he'd return. If someone had tried to take that ring from her, even temporarily, even with promises of return and proper receipts, she'd have fought. He thought about the knee that still ached where shrapnel had torn through, about the men he'd served with who hadn't made it home, about the German soldiers who'd fired the artillery that had nearly killed him, about how war created enemies out of people who'd he never met and would never choose to harm each other absent orders from distant capitals. He thought about what he'd seen in Germany during the final weeks of combat, the refugees flooding roads, the children with hollow eyes, the women searching rubble for anything salvageable, the old men sitting in ruins of homes that no longer existed, the total collapse of a society that had believed itself superior and had discovered itself merely human and vulnerable and broken. Cole lowered his hand. "Keep the ring," he said quietly. The translator began to speak. Cole held up his hand for silence. He pointed to the tray with Helene's other possessions, spoke directly to her, slowly, enunciating each word. "I take these items. I give you receipt for these items. The ring," he pointed at her closed hand, "I never saw, you understand? I never saw the ring." Helene stared at him. The tears she'd been holding finally fell, 2 lines carving through dust on her cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak. Cole took the tray with her coins, photograph, letter, the items that mattered, but not as much as the ring. He filled out the receipt carefully, handed it to her. "Next station is medical inspection. They'll check for disease, not jewelry. After that, housing assignment. Keep the ring on your finger. Nobody will question it. He paused. Your English is good. Keep practicing. Your daughter will need you to help her learn. Helene slipped the ring back onto her finger. It settled into the groove it had worn over 9 years. She looked at Cole with an expression he'd remember decades later. Not gratitude exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that one human being had chosen to see another human being instead of just processing a file. Thank you, Helene whispered, in English. Then in German. Then again in English, because she needed Cole to understand completely. Thank you. I will remember. Always I will remember. She took Emma's hand, moved toward the next station. Cole watched them go, then called for the next person in line, returned to the procedure, took 6 more wedding rings before his shift ended. Each time he recorded them properly, followed protocol, did his job. But that night, writing to Margaret, he told her what he'd done. Told her about the German widow who'd begged to keep her ring. Told her about the choice he'd made to break a small rule for a large reason. Asked if she thought he'd done right. Margaret's response arrived 3 weeks later. 4 words that Cole would keep in his wallet for the rest of his life. You did good. Word spread through Ellis Island, the way information always spreads in closed systems, whispered between women in bathroom. Lines discussed during meal service. Debated in the dormitory barracks, where German families waited for final disposition decisions. Sergeant Cole had let a woman keep her wedding ring, had looked the other way, had broken procedure, had chosen mercy over regulation. The story grew in the telling, the way stories do. Some versions had Cole refusing to take any jewelry from German women. Some had him returning confiscated rings to their owners. Some had him confronting superior officers and demanding policy changes. None of these versions were true, but they reflected something deeper, the desperate hope of people who'd lost control over their lives, who seized any evidence that the system might bend, that individual kindness might penetrate bureaucratic armor. By the next morning, 12 women had approached Station 12, asking if they too could keep their rings. Cole had to refuse. Protocol had reasserted itself. His commanding officer, Captain James Hendricks, had heard about the incident and issued a direct order all valuables must be confiscated and secured. No exceptions. Cole had been lucky to avoid official reprimand. He wouldn't be lucky twice. The women who asked and were refused went away disappointed but not surprised. They'd lived under authoritarian systems long enough to understand that exceptions were exactly that singular moments of grace that couldn't be repeated. They removed their rings, placed them in trays, received their receipts, and tried not to think about the warehouse in Brooklyn, where their small treasures would disappear into inventory. But something had shifted. The guards at Ellis Island men, who'd been trained to see German civilians as defeated enemies requiring processing, started seeing them differently. Started noticing the details they'd been taught to ignore. The way mothers shielded children during medical inspections. The way elderly men trembled when asked about their wartime activities. The way teenagers translated for parents who spoke no English, bearing responsibilities no teenager should carry. Corporal James Martinez, the translator who'd been present during Helene's plea, found himself unable to translate with the mechanical efficiency he'd maintained for months. He started adding context. When a German woman told her story through tears, Martinez didn't just convert words, he conveyed emotion. When an elderly man explained he'd been a schoolteacher, not a soldier, Martinez made certain the processing officer understood the distinction mattered. Private Helen Walsh, who worked in the women's dormitory, started asking questions instead of just issuing orders. Where are you from? What did you do before the war? Do you have family waiting somewhere? The women answered cautiously at first, suspicious of interest that might be interrogation. But Walsh's questions came without judgment, and gradually the women responded with details that transformed them from files into people. Helene noticed the shift. She'd been assigned to Dormitory 7, a long room with 60 bunks arranged in neat rows, housing German women and children waiting for final disposition. She shared a bunk with Emma, the two of them sleeping head to foot in a space designed for one. At night, when lights went out and conversation became possible, the women talked. About the homes they'd left, about the husbands who'd disappeared, about the children they'd buried, about the choices they'd made to survive, about the guilt they carried for having survived, about the uncertainty of their future, and about small mercies, a guard who smiled at a child, a doctor who prescribed extra rations for a malnourished infant, a sergeant who'd let a widow keep her wedding ring. Margarethe Fischer occupied the next bunk, 56 years old. From Hamburg. Her husband had owned a bookstore before the war, then been forced to close it, then been arrested for selling banned literature, then died in detention. Margarethe had survived by working in a munitions factory, her hands still stained by chemicals no amount of washing could remove. She'd been selected for transport because she spoke English well enough to translate for other women. "You were brave," Margarethe told Helene one evening. To ask, to beg. Helene touched the ring on her finger. She'd been touching it constantly since Station 12, verifying its presence, afraid someone would change their mind and demand its surrender. "I wasn't brave. I was desperate." Desperation and bravery looked the same sometimes. They talked about Cole, about what had motivated his decision, about whether he'd face punishment, about whether other guards would follow his example, about whether individual kindness meant anything in a system designed to process people like inventory. "It means something," Margarethe said firmly. "Maybe not to the system, but to you, to your daughter, to everyone who hears about it, it means something. It means one man chose to see you. Actually see you. Not just process you." Helene looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully for the first time since they'd left Munich. The child's face looked younger in sleep, less burdened by understanding beyond her years. Helene pulled the thin blanket up to Emma's chin, touched her wedding ring, thought about Thomas and Munich and the life they'd built together before it all collapsed. The next morning, during breakfast service, Cole walked through the mess hall. He did this every morning, checking security, observing the women and children his station processed, maintaining order without aggression. When he passed Helene's table, she stood. He paused. She extended her hand, palm down, showing the ring on her finger. No words, just the gesture. Cole nodded, continued walking. But the other women at the table saw, understood. One by one, they began talking about their own rings. The ones they'd surrendered, the ones stolen during the war, the ones sold to buy food, the ones lost in the rubble of bombed buildings. Each ring represented a marriage, a promise, a connection to a time before destruction. And because one sergeant had chosen mercy over procedure, these women could talk about their losses without shame, could remember their marriages without needing permission, could hold on to the invisible rings even after the physical ones had been taken. The ripple continued outward. Captain Hendricks called Cole into his office 3 days after the incident. The office occupied a corner of Ellis Island's administrative building windows overlooking New York Harbor, where ships arrived daily with more refugees, more displaced persons, more people requiring processing through systems designed before anyone imagined this volume of human upheaval. Hendricks was 48, career officer, had served in the Great War, stayed in the Army through the Depression, risen through ranks by being competent and careful. He'd learned that military efficiency required clear procedures followed without exception. Exceptions created precedent. Precedent created chaos. Chaos created the kind of administrative breakdown that could destroy careers. Cole stood at attention before Hendricks's desk. The captain held a report 3 pages detailing the incident at Station 12, filed by another sergeant who'd witnessed the exchange, who'd noted Cole's deviation from protocol, who'd correctly identified this as a potential problem requiring official response. "Sergeant Cole," Hendricks said without preamble, "you allowed a German civilian to retain personal jewelry during mandatory confiscation. You failed to complete proper inventory. You falsified official documentation by omitting a listed item. Explain." Cole had known this conversation would come, had spent 3 days preparing his response, had decided that honesty, while risky, was better than attempting to justify the unjustifiable. "Sir," the woman begged. She said the wedding ring was all she had left from her husband, who died in the war. "I made a judgment call that keeping the ring posed no security risk and represented a small mercy that cost us nothing." A judgment call. Hendricks set down the report. "Sergeant, you don't get to make judgment calls about procedure. That's why we have procedures, so individual soldiers don't substitute their judgment for official policy." "Yes, sir. Do you understand what happens if every guard at every station starts making judgment calls? We'd have chaos. We'd have women hiding valuables, claiming sentimental attachment, demanding exceptions. We'd have no inventory, no tracking, no accountability. The entire system would collapse." Cole wanted to argue that the system was already broken, that tracking thousands of wedding rings in her Brooklyn warehouse served no purpose except bureaucratic coverage, that the small mercy he'd shown had cost nothing and meant everything to one woman and her daughter. But he understood military structure. Hendricks wasn't asking for debate. He was establishing chain of command. "Yes, sir. I understand." Hendricks leaned back in his chair. Outside, a ship's horn sounded across the harbor. Seagulls called in the morning air. The city continued its routines, indifferent to the thousands of displaced people passing through this processing station on their way to uncertain futures. "However," Hendricks continued, "I also understand that you served with distinction in North Africa and Sicily, that you were wounded in combat, that your record prior to this incident was exemplary." He paused. "I'm issuing an official warning. No docked pay, no formal reprimand in your permanent file. But this doesn't happen again. If it does, I won't be able to protect you. Clear?" "Clear, sir." "Dismissed." Cole saluted, turned to leave. Hendricks's voice stopped him at the door. "Sergeant, off the record?" Cole turned back. Hendricks's expression had shifted, slightly less commanding officer, more fellow soldier. "I probably would have done the same thing. But I'm 48 years old and 10 years away from retirement. I can't afford the luxury of mercy. You're younger. You still believe individual actions matter." He picked up another file from the stack on his desk. "They do, but they also have consequences. Remember that." Cole left the office understanding he'd been given a gift official warning instead of official punishment. Hendricks could have ended his military career. Had chosen not to. Had chosen his own small mercy while maintaining the appearance of discipline. The message spread through the guard contingent as quickly as it had spread through the refugees. Cole had been called in, had been warned, had been told no more exceptions. The guards understood the implicit message. The system would bend once, maybe twice, but not enough to break. Individual kindness was tolerated as long as it remained individual, as long as it didn't become policy, as long as it could be documented as exception rather than precedent. That evening, Cole stood at Station 12, processing another group of German women. Each one removed her jewelry without protest. Each one received her itemized receipt. Each one moved to the next station. The procedure continued smoothly, efficiently, exactly as designed. But when one woman younger than Helene, maybe 25, with a baby strapped to her chest, removed her wedding ring and hesitated before placing it in the tray, Cole saw the same expression Helene had worn, the same desperate hope, the same understanding that she was about to lose something irreplaceable. Cole reached for the ring. The woman placed it in his palm. Their eyes met. Cole saw her youth, her exhaustion, the baby sleeping against her chest, the complete defeat in her posture. He saw Helene. He saw Margaret. He saw every woman who'd ever loved someone, and lost them, and tried to hold on to memory through physical objects that memory had transformed into sacred relics. He placed the ring in the inventory box, tagged it, recorded it, handed her the receipt, followed procedure exactly. The woman took the receipt, whispered thank you in German, moved to the next station. Cole watched her go, then called for the next in line. The work continued. But he knew what he'd lost in that moment, the capacity to believe that individual mercy could change systems built to resist mercy. 6 months later, Helene Richter stood in a temporary housing facility in Queens, New York, holding a letter from the State Department. The letter, written in formal English that required careful translation, explained her options. She could request repatriation to Germany, specifically to the American occupation zone, where she'd be assigned temporary housing in Munich, pending reconstruction of her former neighborhood. Or she could apply for resettlement as a refugee, remain in the United States, work toward citizenship for herself and Emma. The choice required understanding consequences neither option made clear. Return to Germany meant going back to rubble and rationing, to a country that would take decades to rebuild, to the constant reminder of everything she'd lost. Stay in America meant starting over in a foreign country with no connections, no family, no community, struggling with language and customs, and the permanent status of outsider. Emma, now 10 years old, had opinions. She'd spent 6 months in American schools learning English at the speed children learn languages, through immersion and necessity, and the desperate desire to belong somewhere. She'd made friends, had learned to play baseball, had developed a taste for peanut butter that Helene found baffling. The child wanted to stay. Helene sat at the small table in their shared room. They lived with 4 other families in a converted warehouse, privacy created by hung blankets and mutual respect for boundaries. She touched her wedding ring, had touched it thousands of times over the past 6 months. The ring had become her prayer beads, her meditation object, the physical anchor to a past she couldn't fully release. She decided to write 2 letters, one to the State Department, requesting resettlement, one to Sergeant Raymond Cole at Ellis Island, explaining what his small mercy had meant. The second letter took longer to compose. She wrote it in German first, then translated to English with Margarethi's help. Margarethi lived 3 blocks away, working as a translator for the same refugee services organization that helped Helene navigate American bureaucracy. The 2 women had become something more than friends, the kind of bond formed when people survive crisis together, when they've seen each other at their most vulnerable, when shared trauma creates understanding that transcends normal friendship. Helene's letter to Cole was 3 pages long. She explained that the wedding ring had given her something more than metal had, given her proof that even in systems designed to strip away identity, individual humanity could persist. She explained that Emma asked about the sergeant often, wanted to know if he had children, wanted to thank him somehow for letting her mother keep the ring. She explained that they'd chosen to stay in America, that the ring would remind her not just of Thomas, but also of the American sergeant, who'd chosen kindness when he could have chosen procedure. She mailed the letter not knowing if Cole was still stationed at Ellis Island, not knowing if he'd remember her among the hundreds of women he'd processed, not knowing if her English was good enough to convey what she meant. Cole received the letter 3 weeks later. He was no longer at Ellis Island, had been transferred to Fort Dix in New Jersey, assigned to training new recruits, removed from refugee processing. The transfer had come without explanation, but he understood. Hendricks had protected him while also moving him away from situations that might tempt further mercy. He read Helene's letter alone in the barracks after duty hours. Read it 3 times. Each reading revealed layers he'd missed initially. The woman's gratitude, yes, but also her understanding of what his choice had cost him, her awareness that mercy in institutional systems required personal sacrifice. Cole wrote back. His letter was shorter, less eloquent. He explained that he'd simply done what seemed right, that he hoped Emma was adjusting well to school, that he was glad they'd chosen to stay in America, that this country needed people who understood what tyranny looked like from the inside, who could recognize freedom by its contrast to its absence. He didn't mention his transfer, didn't mention Hendrix's warning, didn't mention the other women he'd processed after Helene, the ones he'd been forced to refuse when they'd asked for the same mercy. He did mention Margaret, explained that he'd written to his wife about the incident, that she'd approved of his decision, that she was raising their sons to understand that rules served people, not the other way around. He included Margaret's address, suggested that perhaps Helene might write to her, that perhaps their wives might find common ground despite having been on opposite sides of a war. The correspondence continued sporadically over the next year. Helene wrote about Emma's progress in school, about her own work as a translator at an import company, about the strange experience of building a new life while carrying memories of the old one. Cole wrote about his sons, about his plans to leave the military and return to farming in Nebraska, about his belief that the post-war world required people who'd seen war Sasquatches to commit to peace. Margaret joined the correspondence. Her letters to Helene carried a different tone, more personal, less formal. She wrote about the challenge of raising sons alone during their father's deployment, about the fear of telegrams, about the relief of reunion, about her own German grandparents who'd immigrated to Nebraska in the 1880s, how they'd faced discrimination during the Great War, how they'd insisted that their children learn English and assimilate because being German in America required constant proof of loyalty. The letters created a bridge across the war, not forgetting none of them could forget, but moving forward while remembering, building connection despite history, recognizing that individual relationships could carry more weight than national enmities. In one letter, Emma added a postscript in careful English. "Thank you for letting my mother keep her ring. When I am older and get married, I will remember that small kindnesses are big things." Cole read Emma's words to his sons, explained what had happened at Ellis Island, explained why he'd broken the rules, asked them what they would have done. The older boy, 12 years old, said he'd have followed orders because orders were orders. The younger boy, 9, said he'd have done what his father did because keeping promises, even promises made through wedding rings, mattered more than following rules. Cole realized his children were learning what he'd learned during the war, that morality lived in specific moments, specific choices, specific decisions made when procedure and humanity diverged. 20 years passed. Cole and Margaret retired to their Nebraska farm. Their sons grew up, served in Korea, returned home, started families. The farm prospered in the post-war agricultural boom. Life assumed the comfortable patterns of small-town America, church on Sundays, county fairs in summer, high school football in fall. Helene built a life in New York. Emma graduated from high school, then college, became a teacher. Helene continued translating, eventually started her own small firm, connecting American companies with German manufacturers, rebuilding their industrial capacity. She never remarried, never removed the wedding ring, never forgot Thomas, but learned to live alongside his absence rather than being consumed by it. The correspondence between the families continued but grew less frequent. Christmas cards, Earth announcements, occasional letters marking significant events. The intensity of the immediate post-war years faded into comfortable friendship maintained across distance. In 1965, Emma Richter traveled to Nebraska. She was 30 years old now, engaged to a man named David Klein, a journalist covering the civil rights movement. They'd planned a cross-country road trip before the wedding, and Emma insisted they stop in Grand Island, Nebraska, to visit the family her mother still wrote to, the family connected by a wedding ring and a moment of mercy 2 decades earlier. Cole was 61 now. His knee ached constantly. His hands showed the wear of farming. His face carried lines earned through sun and work and years of living. But when Emma knocked on his farmhouse door on an August afternoon, he recognized her immediately, not from memory, but from photographs Helene had sent over the years, tracking her daughter's growth from child to woman. Margaret welcomed them into the house, made coffee, brought out photographs, called their sons, who arrived within the hour with wives and children. The farmhouse filled with 3 generations gathered around a woman who represented living history, physical proof that mercy had consequences that rippled across decades. Emma brought gifts. From her mother a letter, several photographs of their life in New York, and something wrapped in cloth. Cole unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a photograph in a silver frame. The photograph showed Thomas and Helene on their wedding day in 1936, Munich, summer, a church Emma recognized from stories. Thomas in a suit, young and confident. Helene in a simple dress, smiling at her new husband with the unguarded joy of someone who still believed the future would be kind. Cole studied the photograph, saw the man whose memory he'd protected without realizing it, saw Helene before war and loss and displacement, saw the marriage that wedding ring represented. Emma explained, her English now fluent, but still carrying traces of German pronunciation. My mother wanted you to see my father, to understand that the ring wasn't just metal. It was this, she pointed at the photograph, this moment, this promise, this man who loved her and whom she loved. When you let her keep the ring, you let her keep him. Margaret put her hand on Cole's shoulder. Their sons sat quietly, understanding they were witnessing something significant. Emma's fiancé took notes, the journalist instinct to record important moments. Cole looked at the photograph for a long time, then at Emma, then at the wedding ring on his own finger-matched set with Margaret's, worn for 28 years through deployment and combat and injury and reunion. Your mother begged, Cole said quietly. I've thought about that moment 10,000 times. Wondered if I did right. Wondered if mercy in one moment justified abandoning procedure that existed for reasons. Wondered if other women I had to refuse deserved the same choice. Emma leaned forward. My mother says you gave her more than a ring. You gave her proof that even in systems designed to dehumanize, individual humans could choose differently. You gave her hope that the world could be rebuilt on better foundations. They talked for hours about Ellis Island, about the war, about reconstruction and reconciliation, about the moral complexity of occupation duty, about small choices that carry enormous weight, about how history gets written in capital letters but lived in small moments. That evening, Cole took Emma to the small cemetery where his parents were buried, showed her the farmland that had sustained his family for 3 generations, explained his belief that mercy wasn't weakness, but the hardest form of strength, choosing to see humanity in people designated as enemies, choosing kindness when procedure demanded indifference. Emma told him about her mother, about how Helene still touched her wedding ring constantly, about how she'd built a successful business but never forgot being a refugee, never forgot standing at Station 12, terrified of losing the last physical connection to her husband, about how she'd taught Emma that gratitude wasn't just feeling, it was action, remembrance, the commitment to extend mercy to others because someone had extended it to you. Before Emma left, she asked Cole one question. Do you regret breaking the rules? Cole looked at Margaret, at his sons, at the grandchildren playing in the yard, at the farm that represented stability and continuity, at his life built across 70 years of choices, both consequential and mundane. No, he said finally. I regret that the rules required breaking. I regret that mercy had to be exception instead of default. I regret that one woman got to keep her ring while others didn't. But I don't regret seeing your mother as a person instead of a file. And I don't regret choosing what was right over what was required. Emma drove away that evening, carrying the photograph. Cole had asked her to take back to Helene a picture of his family, his farm, his life. On the back he'd written, "Your daughter is remarkable. You did well. And yes, I still believe I did the right thing." Helene Richter received the photograph 3 weeks later. She stood in her New York apartment, no longer temporary housing, but a proper home she'd bought with profits from her translation business, and looked at the image of Cole as family. His farm, his American life built on principles he'd learned through war. She placed the photograph next to the one of Thomas, past and present, loss and gratitude. The man she'd married, and the man who'd helped her remember why marriage mattered even after death dissolved it. She touched her wedding ring. Still thin, still warm, still carrying Thomas's memory and Cole's mercy in equal measure. The ring had survived everything: the collapse of Germany, the Atlantic crossing, the bureaucracy of Ellis Island, 2 decades of translating and building and living in a country that had once been enemy and was now home. Emma visited that evening, brought Chinese takeout. They ate together while Emma described Nebraska, the farm, the Cole family, the conversation about mercy, and systems and the choices individuals make when rules and humanity diverge. "He's a good man," Helene said quietly in German, then repeated in English, because Emma preferred English now, had become more American than German, had absorbed this country's language and values and optimism. "A good man who did a good thing when he didn't have to." Emma nodded. "I asked him if he regretted it. He said no." "Of course not." Helene twisted the ring on her finger. "People who choose mercy rarely regret it. It's the people who choose procedure who wake up 20 years later wondering if they should have chosen differently." They talked about the wedding Emma was planning, about whether she'd wear her grandmother's dress, salvaged from the rubble of Munich and carefully preserved, about what kind of ring David would give her, about how marriage was both promise and risk, commitment and vulnerability, the decision to build a life with someone knowing that life could end without warning. "When you give me the ring," Emma said, "I want you to tell David about Sergeant Cole, about the choice he made, about why this ring," she touched her mother's hand, "means more than just metal and marriage." Helene agreed. The story would be part of the wedding, part of the family history they were building, part of the inheritance she'd pass down to Emma's children and their children. Not just the ring, but the story of the ring. Not just the object, but the meaning the object carried. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Helene wrote one final letter to Raymond Cole. Shorter this time. Just 3 paragraphs explaining that Emma's wedding was in 3 months, that the ring would be there, that the story would be told, that mercy multiplies across generations in ways impossible to track, but essential to remember. She signed the letter simply, "With eternal gratitude, Helene Richter." She never received a response. Cole died 2 months later, heart attack, while working his fields, quick and painless, the kind of death farmers hope for. Margaret sent the notification, along with a note saying that Cole had kept all of Helene's letters, that he'd told the story of Station 12 to everyone who'd listen, that he'd believed mercy mattered, especially when it cost something. At Emma's wedding, Helene wore the ring on a chain around her neck alongside her own wedding ring. 2 rings, 2 promises. 2 men who'd shaped her life, one through love, one through kindness. When the rabbi asked about the necklace, Helene told the story. A congregation listened. Several people cried. The story was told at Emma's children's weddings, at their children's weddings, passed down through generations, the details shifting slightly, but the core remaining constant. A German woman begged to keep her wedding ring. An American sergeant chose mercy over procedure, and that choice rippled through decades, touching lives neither could have imagined, proving that small kindnesses become large inheritances when remembered and retold and lived forward. The ring still exists. Emma's granddaughter wears it now, teaching her own children about the grandmother who fled Germany, the great-great-grandfather who died at Stalingrad, and the American sergeant who understood that keeping promises, even promises made through wedding rings, mattered more than following rules designed by people who Dee never stood at Station 12 watching a widow beg. Mercy multiplies, stories endure. And sometimes, when procedure and humanity diverge, individuals choose to be human first, which is the only thing that matters in the end.